Hi, and welcome to the Algerian War podcast, where today we'll be discussing the Algerian War for Independence. I'm one of your hosts, Drew Collins, and I will be joined with two other hosts.
Hi, I'm Alex Cornell.
And I'm Oliver Fix.
Starting off, we'll be discussing the event leading up to the war, causes of the war, and why it was important. But don't worry, because we will give you some background information and overview about Algeria and its revolution to begin.
With a population of around 10 million in 1954, Algeria is a country in the northernmost part of Africa, which mostly practices the religion of Islam. The preferred language in Algeria is Arabic, but French was forced upon them while under French colonial rule. France had colonial control over Africa since the 1830s, and the minority that were the French colonists controlled the Algerian economy. The colonists maintained this domination through coercion and political power.
Due to the little freedom given to the Algerians, they started a revolution. The very violent war was from 1954 to 1962 against the French.
Now that you know general information about the causes of the war, let's get into it. Since the Algerian people had little economic control and autonomy, they despised the French government and the European colonists. The people of Algeria also disliked the colonists because they had taken their land, often the best land for farming. This built up tension and began a powder keg ready to blow up at any point between the two groups.
Eventually, this did happen in 1945, when the Algerians had enough and decided to fight back. The formation of many revolutionary parties and groups who opposed French colonialism started violence between the two groups. An example of this violence is during a parade in the town of Sétif. These Muslim groups mutilated over 20 French police officers and over 100 Europeans that were celebrating in the streets.
This violence continued snowballing to where the French government and colonists murdered thousands of Muslims in retaliation. In 1954, the continued violence prompted the formation of the National Liberation Front, also known as the FLN, which started the Algerian engagement in the war and killed more European settlers.
The FLN was a group that consisted of Muslim nationalists that wanted to rid their country of the French and their government. The National Liberation Front became the most prominent political revolutionary group during the war and led the people to their freedom.
Before the people are freed, however, the war needs to begin. Hostilities began on November 1st, 1954. This revolution's strategies were terrorism and guerrilla warfare. Guerrilla warfare is a form of warfare in which small independent troops harass, delay, and disrupt the opposing military in any way possible. This style of war is often drawn out and is the main reason the war lasted 8 years. During this war, over 300 members of the FLN launched a series of uncoordinated bombings that grew exponentially more forceful and required a response from the French army since French citizens were being targeted. Most citizens were often tortured prior to their killings. In response, the French army dramatically increased their presence in Algeria and began imposing brutal fighting tactics against their native Muslim population.
The first major event taking place in the war, led by the National Liberation Front, was a brutal massacre known as the Philippeville Massacre. It took place in April of 1955, which involved the murder of 37 men, women, and children. Then, in March of 1956, the French gave freedom to Tunisia and Morocco, which had also previously been French colonies. This freedom made the people of Algeria more bold and more pushed to gain their independence.
This push was shortly followed by the Battle of Algiers, which began in September of 1956. The FLN adopted a new form of terrorism after realizing that it wasn't possible for them to compete with the French military head-to-head. Sadi Yakef, an FLN operative, designed a systematic bombing system to target European colonists and military. They placed these bombs in sites that were regularly visited by the colonists, with bonus points if they could assassinate a government official or highly ranked officer of the French army. This brutal terrorism resulted in the murder of a notorious French political leader, Amidi Froger, and attracted much attention from the French security forces, who started taking large measures against the Algerians.
This murder of Amidi Froger, along with a combined Muslim labor strike in 1957 and even more violence from the Muslims of Algeria, enraged the French government. French authorities then began to take drastic measures to eliminate nationalism entirely. This violence was too much for many of the French colonists. The drastic measures caused over 900,000 French settlers to abandon Algeria and return home to a safer community. Eventually, the Algerians created propaganda about the battle. The propaganda displayed the French being inhumane occupants who frequently terrorized the Algerians. It showed members of the French military torturing many FLN operatives and even killing some of them. This was to force them to surrender information about the FLN and their future plans of attack. This sparked more international support, which strengthened the hope of the people of Algeria.
After this, the French began to move in and fight more aggressively. The French oppression of the Algerians drove out the leader of the FLN from his own nation to the former French colony of Tunisia. This separation and government officials created communication problems between the many people in the National Liberation Front. It continued dividing the revolutionaries. This gave them much trouble and confusion throughout the war, which did not help as they were not winning the war. At this point in 1958, the French had 500,000 military troops and had most of Algeria in their control. They were attempting to stop guerrilla cross-border raids by Algerians in Morocco and Tunisia.
Tunisia.
I'm sorry. Tunisia. Even though most of Algeria was under French rule, the military was afraid that all they've done would be completely ruined by the divided political leadership of France. Because of this uncertainty, the Europeans created a Committee of Public Safety on May 13th of 1958.
In autumn of 1958, Charles de Gaulle came to power in France. Due to the turmoil caused by the war, his main priority was ending the conflict with Algeria and bringing peace between the two nations in a safe community for the colonists in France. He began by first touring Algeria to appeal to both colonists and native Algerians, promising them a new constitution that would benefit both sides and would create unity. He also proposed the Constantine Plan, which would put 15 billion francs towards housing, education, and public works for the people of Algeria. The funding for this plan, however, was never raised, and thus the plan was never implemented. This created skepticism from the Algerians, and they started to question if the French really wanted to bring peace. In order to still try to please the Algerians, the French president, Charles de Gaulle, officially declared that Algeria would be able to govern itself, but they would still remain a French colony. Although this may not have been complete freedom, it was definitely a big step forward for Algeria and for their forthcoming nation.
De Gaulle. Before I go, is it de Gaulle or de Gaulle?
De Gaulle.
De Gaulle's plan, however, fell through as French settlers and army officers violently opposed his ideas, causing him to lose their favor. Then the Algerians gave up on the plan to bring peace because the French hadn't followed through for the second time in a row. Muslim nationalists then attempted to gain complete control of their country by re-engaging with the French. Engagement did not go well for the Algerians, as in December, Algeria's new military commander, General Maurice Chalet, began attacking major FLN positions in Kabylia. In Kabylia. How do you say his name? Chal? Or is it Chali?
Chow.
I said Chal. Should I just restart?
Just say
I said Chali.
Just say Chow and his Muslim troops.
Chal and his Muslim troops that favored France killed over half of the FLN operatives that were located in Kabylia. Chal even began planning a second phase that was supposed to take out even more FLN operatives.
The second phase, however, never occurred, as in 1960, de Gaulle came to realize that if they kept control over Algeria, then millions of Muslims would become part of the citizens of France and drastically change their culture and identity. This made him rethink his decision and decided to support Algerian self-independence entirely. Early in 1961, Charles de Gaulle and Algerian governor Paul Delouvrier fled from Algiers due to a revolt that started from their own European settlers and military. They were upset by de Gaulle's support of Algerian independence after all of those years of fighting. This was quickly quashed, however, when de Gaulle addressed the French people on national television on January 28th. This broadcast attempted to convince the French people of the plan. 3 days later, on February 1st, the French military swore loyalty to the government. This then collapsed the rest of the revolt.
Then, an anti-Muslim terrorist group was created a little after the revolt. This group placed bombs in highly frequented Muslim areas and sometimes killed other colonists if they considered them traitors. This bombing led to the death of over 1,000 people. This group was called the Secret Army Organization, or the OAS.
In June of 1961, Charles de Gaulle flew FLN operatives from the recently established government in Tunisia to France to hold a secret meeting with them. He was attempting to achieve peace between France and Algeria. De Gaulle then made an appeal on television to negotiate an end of the war with the FLN and their provisional government. He started to talk peace from June 25th to June 29th. The peace meetings were unfortunately unsuccessful, but de Gaulle would not give up. He visited Algeria in December with intention to continue the efforts to end the conflict. He was greeted with Muslim rallies that were for the FLN and Muslim riots that were against all the European colonists. A few days later, the United Nations recognized Algeria as a separate nation, and in January of 1962, Algeria was officially voted to be an independent country.
Due to this new given freedom, the colonists made a journey back to their homelands. Around 1 million colonists moved back to France, Spain, and Italy. Some 30,000 colonists remained in Algeria and often lost most of their property. Then peace talks resumed. The two countries finally came to a conclusion on May 18th of 1962. The official freedom came on July 4th of the same year. The FLN's Provisional Committee came to power. Then in September, Ahmed Ben Bella was elected as first president of the nation of Algeria.
This bloody war cost the lives of 21,000 European deaths. 18,000 of these were people from the French military, and 3,000 were the European colonists that lived there. On top of the 21,000 deaths, 300,000 Muslims died during the war.
Now that the details of the war are wrapped up, it is time to talk about the efforts of the war and what happened to the country after they gained independence. First, however, we would like to give a huge shout out to Brawl Stars for sponsoring today's podcast. And now for our sponsorship, Brawl Stars. Brawl Stars is a free-to-play mobile game made by Supercell. The point of the game is to battle with brawlers who each have different abilities and gain trophies. There are different game modes and ways to play. You can unlock brawlers in various different ways, including star drops. Collect as many brawlers as you can, and not just from star drops, but also with something called credits. Use coins and power points to upgrade brawlers. Brawl Stars is a very fun game and can be found on Apple App Store and Google Play Store. Thanks for listening, now back to the podcast. Now for the last portion of the podcast, we will be discussing the effects of the Algerian War and what it meant for Algeria as a new nation. For Algeria, this was a massive deal for them as they finally had autonomy, self-determination, and independence. Although this obviously came with a cost for both Algeria and the French, on both sides this war was torturous and fatal for many fighting in the war. This caused lots of mourning from families who lost their loved ones during the war.
Gaining independence wasn't all perfect for Algeria and their government. The National Liberation Front instantly became the ruling political party and banned any opposition against them. But many Muslims and non-FLN people believed that Algeria should have stayed under the French government, or at least under France's colonial rule. This created revolts against this new government establishment. These were led by both the Muslims and the colonists who stayed in the country after the official independence of Algeria. In 1965, there was a coup or an attempt to overthrow a government against the new Algerian government led by the French and Algerians. The people also attempted to kill the new Algerian president. They tried to pull this off while he was sleeping. It was unsuccessful, however, but still cast a threat on the Algerian government and all officials working for it. There were many other incidents like this coup. One was involving pro-French Muslims revolting against the FLN, but this still wasn't the worst of their problems.
Algeria's policies were marked with controversy over the years. The FLN ruled for over 25 years with many different leaders. The government lasted these 25 years without multi-party elections. Then, in 1990, the FLN, which gave in to pressure from Algerian strikes, protests, and riots, held their first multi-party election, which they lost. Then the government kept getting more and more divided. These political divisions led to the Algerian Civil War. This war was as long, bloody, and harsh as the Independence War. In fact, it was 3 years longer. At the end of the war, which was in 2002, the FLN restored themselves as a major political party in Algeria. The FLN is now in control of approximately 1/3 of the country's political positions.
With all that being said, Algeria has had many issues since gaining their independence, and it hasn't been easy. They were one of the last African colonies, as most of the decolonization ended 2 years before their independence. Conflicts on top of conflicts have been pressed upon them, but despite all this, they have been able to recover economically and somewhat politically. In 2021, their oil and gas sector of economy grew exponentially to 3.9% after taking a massive 5.5% contraction in 2021. This increase is projected to get even larger and larger each year.
While we have been talking about the effect going on in Algeria, we haven't talked about France. This war left a huge mark on French reputation due to the tactics they used during the war. There was a political firestorm during 2001 when former General Paul Assarsis published memoirs about the war and his experience in it. In these memoirs, from 1955 to 1957, he described the use of torture against Algerians to receive information about the FLN. This particular general even defended the torture as it was supposedly necessary to the French. By using these torturous methods on Muslims and delaying Algeria's independence, France undermined its principles of war and caused much unnecessary death and destruction to both countries. France also humiliated itself in front of the whole world when it wasn't able to hold on to its colony. When France lost Algeria, it also ended France's entire colonial empire.
In the end, the war had benefits and drawbacks for Algeria, but it was a massive event in the country's history. They went through rough patches during the fighting, but nonetheless achieved the same goal. Now, let's go over a very quick summary of all that happened.
France has had control of Algeria since the 1830s. The Muslims in Algeria disliked being ruled by the French and despised the European colonists that had settled in their land. The French dominated the Algerian economy, which is a main reason why the Algerians disliked them so much. They finally had enough and started the war in 1954.
The war was long and bloody. It lasted 8 years, and over 321,000 people died because of it. The Nation Libertarian Front was the main political nationalist party that led the Algerians through the war. Terrorism and guerrilla warfare were the main strategies used throughout the war by the French and people of Algeria. The main battle during the war was the Battle of Algiers. It resulted in a French victory over the Algerians, but still helped the Algerians due to propaganda that was released shortly after the battle. The propaganda gave Algeria much international support and gave them their first real hope of freedom.
Then, in 1958, Charles de Gaulle came to power. He wanted to end the Algerian conflict and bring peace between the two countries. After many failed attempts at peace, de Gaulle and the FLN came to the conclusion in 1962 and Algeria became its own nation. The FLN seized political control right away and held on to it for 25 years. After the war, there had been much inter-country fighting about the government. Now Algeria has resolved the large conflicts in government and economy to what we know as Algeria today.
And that will be all for today's podcast. If you're interested, we also have a website with all the details of the podcast. I'm Drew Collins, joined by Alex Quinnell and Albert Fix, and this is the Algerian War Podcast. We thank all of you for listening and hope you have a great rest of the day.